Thank you. All right, so now I would like to welcome to the stage Melissa Boggs. I'm so excited she could join us. Many of you are probably familiar with her podcast, and she's going to talk to us about the truth about Agile.
Faye, are these human people?
I think all of them are.
Like in real life? Like, I'm not going to touch you, but I could touch you because you're real. She's going to give me a hug. We just met. She's like, I'll give you a hug. Good morning, friends. That was just my little bit. It was supposed to be funny. All right. Good morning, and I'm just so excited to be here. I mean, I know everyone that comes up here says this every time because it's the polite and respectful thing to say, but for real, human people in a room. So I know Faye already asked who's been here before, who are newbies. I have one more question for you. How many of you are attending a conference, any kind of conference, for the first time in maybe 3 years? Right. So we're all like, oh, human people. Some of you, though, I know this. You haven't told me, but I know this. Some of you almost didn't make it because this morning you got up and you were like, ooh, hard pants. So we all got here. We all put our hard pants on. Some of us went with the stretchier jean. That's okay. That's okay. But because you made it today, do you guys remember DVDs? My kids, I have teenagers, and my kids legitimately are like, oh, I'm so into DVDs right now because they're so vintage. What? But you know on DVDs, you have like the director's cut where you get like a little bit of narration about the movie. And inexplicably, it's like they're interviewing the director and all you can see is the side of their face. And you're like, why? Why can't they just like turn to the camera? I wanted to give you just really quickly the director's cut of this talk. So this talk, The Truth About Agile, I began to put together, I would say about halfway through the pandemic. I had just left my role at Scrum Alliance and was really wrestling, like a lot of us, with priorities, right? We were in the middle of a pandemic and we were faced with mortality and what matters to us and what's important. And I started thinking about my work in the Agile space, and I've been doing this for a long time. I first started identifying as an Agilist in 2008. And over the years, when you're part of a movement that is essentially a social movement, things change. And the movement begins to change. And I was wrestling a little bit about my place in that and what it looks like to actually embrace Agile values and principles. And so what you're about to experience in this talk is a little bit of that wrestling. And what ultimately started as a Hail Mary to the Agile movement is now sort of my love letter to the Agile movement. And so I hope you'll enjoy coming along this ride with me. I am going to switch over on the laptop here real quick, but while I'm doing that, I want you to imagine for just a moment a high school English classroom. So in this particular classroom, you can probably imagine the one that you went to when you were in high school. This classroom is set up with pods. So there are 6 desks at each pod. And there's probably, I don't know, I'd guess about 5 or 6 pods in the classroom. And it is 8 a.m. and the bell is ringing. Can I get a slideshow maybe? It is 8 a.m. and the bell has rung. And sorry. There we go. Backing it up, picturing your English classroom, pods of desks, and the bell has rung, and 30 15-year-olds burst into the classroom. And some of them are talking about the latest TikTok trend. Some of them are talking about, oh, so-and-so likes so-and-so. But they're all beelining their desks. They are all like almost running to their desks. They're putting up their learning canvas. They are hanging their team flag. And they're all standing around their desk. They begin their daily stand-up. they start talking about what they're going to do for the day. One team is sort of arguing, should we split this story so that we can kind of work on it simultaneously, or maybe we should swarm on it so we can get it across the finish line and pick up the next story after that. A teenage Scrum Master approaches the teacher and he says, "Mr. Boggs, Isaiah was missing yesterday. We gave him the worksheet that we worked on, but he needs a little bit more help. He doesn't quite understand the worksheet." To that point, the teacher has said nothing, except saying hello to kids as they walked in the door. He doesn't have to, because last week in sprint planning, they had planned their entire 2-week sprint. I had a front row seat to some of the most pure, exceptional, innovative agility that I have ever seen, because my husband, an English teacher of 18 years, spent his final 5 years applying Agile principles in the classroom. It was a beautiful, pure thing to see. I love this quote: "A mind that is stretched by a new experience can never go back to its old dimensions." I spend a lot of time talking to people at conferences like this, or virtual conferences in the breakout rooms. And I started to get worried. This is where the wrestling came from. I started to get worried that maybe a lot of people weren't having a new experience. That when it came to agility, we were actually just painting old ways of working and old practices with agile paint. But we weren't actually having a new experience. So what I want to do today is challenge what you've been told about Agile, inspire you to think about it a little bit differently. And for those of you who have been doing this a long time, this is my call to you. Because as we go through this, you might be tempted to say, "Oh, I've heard this a million times." And sure you have. If you've been doing this a long time, I hope you've heard the Manifesto a million times, and I hope that you've heard the principles. But maybe it's time that we stop and think about it again. Maybe it's time that we stretch our own minds again, even if we've been doing it a long time. So I'm going to start with the origin story. It's like a Marvel movie. Every superhero social movement has an origin story. So back in 2001, 17 individuals came together in Snowbird, Utah for beer, skiing, and software. I have it on good authority that that was the order of priority. But they came together because all of them were working in a different way. So you had representation from all of the different flavors of agility that you've heard of, but Agile wasn't even a word yet, at least not in this sense. But they recognized that even though they were all doing things a little bit differently, there was a tie that binds them. And that was rebellion. And I love that. I don't know if that's the word that they would use, but to me, I always describe the Manifesto signers as the Star Wars Rebel Alliance, because I'm a nerd. I've already said Marvel and Star Wars in the last 30 seconds. But the thing is, a lot of people, when I say that, assume that Waterfall was the empire, but it actually wasn't. Waterfall has its place. In things that are known and can be predicted, it's okay to plan things out. But let's think about this. Most work these days is knowledge work, and you can't predict it. And that's what they recognized. What they were rebelling against was the notion that humans can be treated like machines, that all work is the same, and that we can plan everything as if nothing new is going to happen. Wouldn't that be lovely? But it's not. So they came together and they had several days of discussion about what are the things that are the same. You know, some were doing Kanban, some were practicing Scrum. There were all kinds of flavors of lean. What are the things that bring us together that make sense? Because they knew that if they could lean into that, into these values and these principles that we're about to talk about, they would be more successful together than trying to each rebel separately. So it became a movement. So you've probably seen this a million times, but again, Even if you have, I don't think we stop and look at it enough. So this is the original website. They have intentionally not changed it. If you go to agilemanifesto.org, you can see this picture of them. It's quite grainy, and it has the actual values of the Agile Manifesto. I'm going to break it down for you just a little bit. I find often that we focus on the values, but we don't talk about the intro and the ending of the manifesto. So I'm going to read it to you. We are uncovering better ways of developing software or product by doing it and helping others do it, period. I point this out because these were not ivory tower consultants putting together something to sell. These were folks who were doing the work. They were developers. They were developing and helping others develop software. Through this work, we have come to value individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Working software over comprehensive documentation. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Responding to change over following a plan. And the best part of the entire manifesto that helps every argument that everyone ever has about applying Agile values, that is, while there is value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. I don't know how many times I have walked into an organization and had people say, well, we can't do Agile, we have to plan. Nobody ever said we didn't need to plan. Nobody ever said that planning wasn't valuable. We're just saying that we value humans more. It's kind of a long quote, so I'm actually going to just give you a second and let you read it. My favorite thing about this quote: the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. And I don't know about you, but I think they did. So there is some lore around how they chose the word Agile, and I won't go into that right now, but there were lots of words at play in that retreat when they were trying to decide what they were going to call these values and principles. But they chose Agile, and if you can see, just after 2000, this is a representation of like the use of the word Agile on Google, and it leapt exponentially. So I'd say that they changed the world. And I often wonder if when they were in that room, when they were coming up with these values and principles and they were naming it Agile, if they had any idea that what they were doing would lead to an English classroom in Denver completely reworking the way that they teach English. Can you imagine being one of those gentlemen that was in that room and like sitting up and looking around and going, wow, they set out to change things and they actually did. And just in time. So this is a depiction of the adoption of different types of technologies and things over the years and how quickly those things were adopted. The only thing that is really important about this graph is I want you to see the shape of the graph compared to the shape of the ending of this one. Right at the time that the world began to exponentially increase the pace of change, they had proposed a set of values and principles that would help us cope with that. So they were just in time. So I want to talk a little bit about that word. So here's one definition of the word Agile, and I like to call this one, this is just me, capital A Agile. Relating to or denoting a method of project management used especially for software development that is characterized by the division of tasks in short phases of work and frequent reassessment and adaptation to plans. That sounds boring. But then there's this one. Able to move quickly and easily. That sounds like somewhere that I want to work or some way that I want to be, just in my life. Here's another way of looking at it. Story points, velocity, sprints, demos, retrospectives, TDD, backlog. These are all words that we throw around all day, every day. And there's nothing wrong with these words. These are amazing words, and these are practices that I believe in. But none of these things showed up in the Manifesto for Agile Software Development. These are practices, and practices are important. But they are not as important as delivering high-quality value on a regular basis and continuously getting better at it. That's what they were looking for when they wrote these values. Build your organization in such a way that it can listen closely and move quickly. And that's when it starts to stretch into your organizational structures, how people provide feedback to one another. That's when we start to get into the heart of what agility was really meant to be. Because if you don't, this is what you end up with. Methodology madness. And I have to give credit, David Bland put this up on Twitter while I was building this talk, and I reached out to him and I was like, can I please share this in my talk? Because it is a perfect description. How many times I have walked into an organization and heard people arguing, should we do Kanban or should we do Scrum? I don't care. I, the former co-CEO of Scrum Alliance, do not care what framework you use. What I care about is if you understand why you're doing it. If you understand how to help your organization listen and move. So for the next few minutes, I want to walk through the principles with you. A lot of people here have heard of the Manifesto, but not as many people know that there was a set of 12 principles that they wrote the same weekend. They came out with both of them at the same time. And these have been my guiding star. It is combined metaphors. My guiding light and my North Star. And I think it's important that we walk through them. Again, if you've been an Agilist for a long time, sit in it. Let's feel it for a few minutes. Let's think about agility and not just capital A Agile. I've also kind of reframed them for you a little bit, gave you a couple words to remember them by. So let's get started. Principle 1, our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery. I'm just going to say of value, because we all know that these principles now can apply across the board. So continuous delivery of value. There's two things in this that are really important to me. One is satisfying the customer. How do you know what the customer wants if you don't talk to them? That's my question. How many of us actually have discussions with our customers as a team, showing them actual software or value that you're delivering? Not many. There's usually like a telephone game that happens with the customer. So how do you know if you're satisfying them if you don't even have an opportunity to talk to them? The second piece is early. We as humans are perfectionists. We don't want to put anything in front of customers until it's perfect. But what if it is so perfect that it's something that they could not care less about? Because whatever it is that you've been working on for 2 years is something they left behind 1.5 years ago. So early is really important. And as a bonus, the continuous part is really important too, because they have an opportunity to start using things even before it's perfect, before it's done. Principle 2, welcome changing requirements even late in development. Agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. So it's not just tolerate change. It's not just, okay, we'll accept that change request. We are embracing it. We are recognizing that change is going to happen, and we can harness it and make it wonderful for ourselves, for our customers. We're going to embrace it. Principle 3, deliver working software frequently, from a couple of weeks to a couple of months, with a preference to the shorter time scale. This one's hard for folks too when it comes back to the perfectionism. But it's super important that we keep that flow of communication, we keep that feedback loop going with our customers, because that takes us back to principle 1, right? So putting ourselves on a cadence helps too. So when we talk about the couple of weeks to a couple of months, giving ourselves some frame and some constraints, if you will, to kind of help us make that decision to deliver, rather than, okay, we'll do it next week. We'll do it next week. It'll be perfect next week. That can go on for a really long time. Principle 4, business people and developers must work together daily through the project. Ooh, we have to talk to the business people? Newsflash, everyone, we are all business people. We all work at businesses, we all have customers. What they're referring to is, especially 20 years ago, but I think it's true now as well, that game of telephone, those silos that we would create, those barriers, where we would say, oh no, you go talk to the customer, and then you send us a 50-page document about what the customer said. That is not good for them, that is not good for us, that is not good for the customer. We've actually got to bring this together and break down those silos so that we can have smooth embracing of change along the way. Principle 5, build projects around motivated individuals, give them the environment and the support that they need, and trust them to get the job done. If I have learned anything in my now, oh no, I'm not going to tell you how long I've been in business. If I have learned anything in my many, many years, maybe decades of working in software in particular, but just in the business world in general, we have a trust problem. I actually work specifically right now on helping leaders and their teams build bidirectional trust. Because in some ways what this is talking about is self-organization. We're going to get to that in a minute, but in order for that to work, the trust actually has to be in both directions. So the leader has to trust the teams, but the teams have to trust the leader, or they're not going to take any risks. There will be no innovation. There will be no moving forward of the product. So for me, this isn't just about, okay, leaders, let them execute on the task that you gave them. But rather, we actually have to work to create trust in our organizations. Principle 6, the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversation, and oh, has that been challenged for the past 2.5 years. We first started the pandemic and everyone's like, okay, we're gonna work from home for 2 weeks. You guys remember that? Do you remember when we thought we were gonna go back in 2 weeks? Luckily, it has been 20 years since these principles were written. We have tools that we didn't have back then. Now, I'm not saying they're ideal. I'm not saying they're as good as being in person. They are exhausting. Zoom fatigue is real. But it does allow us to have human contact. And I believe that that's what they were really talking about with this principle. Because 20 years ago, again, there was this whole process of, I'm going to write a 50-page requirements document. I'm going to pass it over to the BA. The BA is going to pass it over to the lead developer. I mean, it just went through this series of silos and handoffs. And you remember that game of telephone? I keep referring to it, but there's my kids again are teenagers. We're not too far away from this, where one kid says something like, "I really like your shirt," And then like 8 kids later, it's something like the monster has gotten into the fort and everyone's just really confused. So instead of like a compliment, you're like running from the monster that doesn't exist. And I think that happened, right? By the time it got to the end, it was like some convoluted thing that actually wasn't what we were intending. Principle 7, working software is the primary measure of progress. To me, I might be projecting, but this one's a little bit about metrics. Okay, this one's a lot about metrics. And my favorite analogy to give is that if my mother-in-law is coming to visit, and I ask my 13-year-old son to clean his room, and halfway through the day I am judging simply on trash picked up, or only on the number of socks picked up from the floor, that might be a really high number. That does not mean that I am comfortable with my mother-in-law walking into his bedroom. Because the primary measure of progress is a clean room that my mother-in-law is not going to comment on. Sorry. Actually, for the record, my mother-in-law is awesome and she would never comment. But I love the analogy. But we have a tendency with metrics to look at it as if it's the whole picture, right? When generally metrics are a single data point and a much bigger picture. So why aren't we just looking at whether or not the software we're building or the product we're building or the value that we're delivering works and is satisfying the customer and satisfying the need? And as long as we're continuing to build on that working value, that should be our primary measure of progress. Now, I'm not saying that metrics are useless. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have them, but we should understand them. We should recognize they are a single data point amongst many data points, and we should take them for what they are, which is just that, a data point. Oh, this is my pet principle. Principle 8, Agile processes promote sustainable development. The sponsors, developers, and users should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. Do you know what it means to maintain a pace indefinitely? That pace has to be sustainable. I always tell this story about how when I was in middle school and high school, I grew up in Alaska, and I was a state track champion. And you can tell, I've done this talk, by the way, virtually, and at least you can see me. I am 5 foot tall. My coach literally said to me, "You have Chihuahua legs." He was right. I do have really short legs. There is no way that you are going to outrun everyone else on this field. You have to be strategic. You have to know yourself. You have to know your pace. And so instead of focusing on, could I out-sprint anyone else, I started to learn who I was as a runner in my body. And I won state in the mile 4 years in a row because I knew who I was and I knew what my pace was. And year after year, we would jump out the gate, and I would be the last one out the gate, and I did not care. Because I knew after the first lap, everyone in front of me was going to start to slow down. I would keep my pace because I knew what it was. Because my coach helped me focus on sustainability. Make it through all 4 laps around that track. And I did. And usually by the 3rd lap or so, I was like in 1st or 2nd place. And then generally, humble brag, 11-year-old Melissa was probably a good half a lap in front of everyone else by the time I finished. And I only tell you that story because it took effort and discussion with my coach and practice for me to understand what that was, for me to understand my body, how to kind of feel when my breathing was getting too fast, that I needed to like hold it right here. And it takes that for teams too. You have to actually have the conversation. What does it look like for us to have sustainable pace? What does it look like for our customers to have sustainable pace? Tell this one really quick. I once worked for an organization that was still shipping CD-ROMs to our customers. And I would say this was like the 20-teens. Those customers were not prepared to have a weekly release. And we got them there eventually. Like, we helped them understand how this was beneficial to them and how they could keep up with this pace, but it took time. And so it's not even just about your team. Like, you have to have a conversation with the whole ecosystem about sustainable pace. But it is possible. But you have to talk about it that way. You can't even like beat around the bush. We need to have a conversation about what it looks like to be able to maintain the same pace indefinitely. And when you do, you end up with chihuahua legs half a lap ahead of everyone else. Principle 9, continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. It hurts my heart so deeply when developers tell me that they hate Agile because they feel like it makes them have to cut corners, because they feel like it makes them have to fit into this 2-week block of time, and that just means rushing. That is not what we meant when we decided to work this way. We have to get really good at slicing our work into valuable slices that we can pay attention to technical excellence. We have to get really good at understanding what it looks like to put something of quality out, and whatever it is that your cadence is, whatever that time frame is. But Agile, capital A Agile, is not an excuse to cut corners. I promise you 17 developers did not go into a room and say, yeah, let's mess this all up. Let's just go real fast and shoot things out the door, and it's fine, it'll be broken. We'll just fix it later. They didn't do that. We're almost there, 3 more. Principle 10, simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done is essential. I want you to just read that again. In our era of productivity and our focus on output, this is really hard for people to get their heads around. But we actually really need to focus on what is the simplest thing that we can try to make sure that our hypothesis is going to work. If you think about Lean Startup and Eric Ries, he had this really, really well in his book. How do we do the simplest things so that we don't spend time on things that are not worth our time? How do we maximize not doing stuff? Keep going back to my kids, but my teenage son is real good at this. Real good. And you have to give him props for it, right? He finds the shortest way possible to get things done. Principle 11, the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. I love self-organization. I would say I actually spend a good majority of my coaching time these days working with leaders about how to help teams be able to self-organize. But this is not an easy task. And recognizing the value of that self-organization kind of gives us the oomph to keep working on it. Because if you're going to have self-organization, you have to have context. You have to have boundaries. People have to have information that, as a leader, you might not be used to giving to them. But if you recognize that the value is that the best architectures, the best requirements, and the best designs emerge from the people who are closest to the work, who have spent the most time with the code or whatever product it is that you're building, and hopefully, because of Principle 1, with the customer as well, then if you can create the environment as a leader where those teams can just run with it within bounds, then you are going to get amazing innovative work. And I'm telling you, you see all these articles how do we unleash innovation? How do we create innovative spaces? Do we have a hackathon? Hackathons are fun. That is not going to create the best designs, architectures, and designs. Unleashing your people on a day-to-day basis, that's what's going to do it. And 12. At regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective, then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. Ding, retrospectives, right? But how many of us have been to like 6 retrospectives in a row and absolutely nothing's changed? The key to this is that we don't just inspect, we don't just come together and have a event session. We come together and we talk about how are we working, how are we communicating, how are things going on a day-to-day basis, and then we identify something that we can work on. We identify something that we can adapt, and we do that as a team, and it is not a manager that is telling us what we should adapt. It is us coming together and saying, hey, you know what? I really didn't like how that went last week. It didn't feel good. How do we communicate better? How do we prevent that from happening? And then we do something about it. Gosh darn it. We make a plan and we do something about it. So here's the key to all 12 of those principles as far as I'm concerned. In one way or another, in every one of those principles, what I see is people first. People first. Because the thing is, putting people first is a business proposition. When we allow people to work together, to self-organize, to inspect their work, to adapt it, and most importantly, to put it in front of customers, we open all kinds of doors. When customers have the ability to give us feedback along the way, not only are we building a better product, but you have just created a team of champions for this product. You know how excited people get when they get to like go out and brag about something and be like, oh yeah, I helped that company with that product. You should buy it. When you allow customers to come to the table and tell you what is working and what isn't, or whether or not they would actually use what you're building, you save time, you save money, and you save heartache. Because I promise you, creatives, whether they're developers or any other kind of creative, one of the worst things that you can do is let them build something that no one's going to use. Because that is entirely deflating. So putting people first is a business proposition. I love this quote from Ed Catmull from Pixar because he's talking about how building this kind of environment is a day in, day out, full-time job. And he's speaking very generally. By the way, if you have not read Creative Inc., it is such an incredible book because essentially it's talking about agility and he never uses the word agile. But he's talking about how this takes work. And this is how I feel about our principles. They have to be front of mind. We have to be thinking about them when we're talking about checking the list of practices that we do. If you're assessing your agile maturity, we need to be thinking about whether or not we are actually working through the lens of these principles. Otherwise, we're just checking boxes. Uh-oh. Are you ready? Oh, no? You want to talk for another 20 minutes and then you're ready for the truth? All right, I'm going to reveal the big truth. The big, big, big truth. It's very complex. It's very shocking. I don't know if you're ready for it, but I think I can give it to you right now, and hopefully you can handle it. The actual truth about Agile. And I know some of you actually came because you're like, ooh, that sounds saucy. What is she going to say? The truth about Agile is it's 4 values and 12 principles, people. And I put a little spinny on it because it's not that complicated. And I had to give it like a little bit of flair. But the truth is that agility is 4 values and 12 principles. And if someone is selling you something else, I'm not saying it's bad, but that's not Agile. Agile is not a set of practices that you have to check the box for. Because the fact is that the Agile mindset is bigger and wider and deeper than any set of practices that someone's going to put in front of you. So the truth about Agile is that it is 4 values, it is 12 principles. And practices without principles are ineffective at best and damaging at worst. And this is my Hail Mary to the Agile movement. Because at the end of the day, the Agile mindset is deep and it is wide. It is disciplined. It asks us to reject old practices, old ways of working, and replace them with new, more human-centric ways. It is poetic and it is soulful because it begs us to bring our whole self to work and to show up every day with everything that we have and all of our vulnerability. It's creative. It calls out innovation from us. It calls out for us to think differently and to break down walls. When I look at these kids that I described to you at the beginning, these 15-year-olds who come to school and they're so inspired. And this wasn't just like one class. I just want to make sure this is clear. My husband did this for 5 years. And year after year, these kids came to school excited to do work because they had autonomy, because they could choose to lean into their best strengths to get the job done, because they worked together as a team. All of this sound familiar? Here's the thing though. When we have children learning that way, and we are still unlearning right alongside them, we're going to have to dig deep, because by the time they get to our world, our corporate world, they are going to have a different set of expectations, and we better be ready to meet them there. They are going to come to the workplace expecting autonomy, creativity, innovation, working as a team. And so we have a lot to unlearn. But I see so much hope in them because they come to the table, man, and they are ready. So my question to you is, what are we going to do? Are we just going to follow the practices of Scrum? No shade on Scrum. I love Scrum. But are we just going to do 2-week sprints and count some story points and worry about velocity? Or are we going to look back at these 12 principles and seek to change the world? Thank you.